Hello and welcome to episode 60 of the Machine Ethics Podcast. This time we're talking to Madhulika Srikumar from the Partnership of AI. This episode was recorded on the 22nd of June 2021. We chat about managing the risks of AI research, how should the AI community think about the consequences of their research, possibly documenting best practices for AI research. We look at OpenAI with their GTP2, talking about their research disclosure, considering unintended consequences and negative downstream outcomes, and what your research may actually be contributing. We talk about promoting scientific openness, proportional ethical reflection, and research social impact assessments. You can find more episodes of the Machine Ethics Podcast at machine-ethics.net. You can contact us at hello@machine-ethics.net. You can follow us on Twitter at machine_ethics, on Instagram, Machine Ethics Podcast, or if you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/machine ethics. Thanks very much and hope you enjoy. Hi, welcome to the podcast. If you could please introduce yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Great. Thanks for having me, Ben. My name is Madhu. I am a program lead at the Partnership on AI. So that's a multi-stakeholder, organization that's been established to advance responsible AI practices. My mandate as a program lead is to identify what are some of the pressing, ethical conundrums that the AI industry, is kind of dealing with currently, and really work with stakeholders within the community. So that can be civil society organizations, the tech companies themselves, and academic organizations, to really identify what are those pressing issues which can be, high impact and can produce some sort of a consensus that, we can all work towards as a community.
Great. And do you have kind of for people who don't know, Partnership of AI, in AI?
On AI.
On AI. What kind of organizations are there?
Sure. So the Partnership on AI, or PAI, was established back in 2016, and it has about over 100 organizations. So it started out being established by some of the chief scientists from the leading tech companies, so Google and Apple and Amazon. But there are also a variety of civil society organizations who are part of this project. So Data and Society in New York and AI Now Institute at NYU. And there are also several academic institutions like the Berkman Center at Harvard, or even perhaps scientific labs like the Allen Institute. So it's really bringing together some of the biggest actors in this space who are thinking about some of the moral, ethical dilemmas that are posed by these technologies.
Before we dive any further, there's a question we always ask, which I know that you are excited to answer by the look of your face. What is AI?
Ooh. Yeah, I feel like that's a question that trips me up every single time I hear it. I think the best way I think about it is AI is really being able to predict something that comes next in a particular pattern. I know that sounds vague, in part because AI is used in so many different ways, right? It's used to predict health outcomes. It is being used perhaps inappropriately to predict if someone can be a criminal in another instance. But also it's used to kind of identify who's a candidate that should, proceed to the next stage in a hiring process. So the way I look at it, it's really being able to predict what comes next. There's, of course, a lot of critique of AI that it's neither artificial nor intelligent. So that's something that I really want to center, even when I think about, what AI really means and what it doesn't.
I'm really interested in your organization because it's one of those kind of big, interesting things that happened in 2016 when there was kind of the beginning of this kind of more broad look into the ethical impact of AI. And I felt like there was, in 2016 onwards, we had this kind of whirlwind of interest. There was because more people interested in what AI was, what it can do, and what the issues of AI were. Whereas before that, maybe there was murmurings, but it became more mainstream at that point, I think. what kinds of things have Partnership on AI produced, or like is there kind of like these really good messages that have happened since then? What are the things that you have contributed, I guess, you guys over there? I know obviously you've not been there the whole time, but joined recently.
Great. So the project that we're going to be talking about, which is going to be the subject of our conversation today, is this whole question of how should the AI scientific community, the AI research community, really contend with the societal consequences of their research. So we're going to be chatting more about it, but that's something that I'm really excited about. And we have kind of come out with a set of best practices for how individual researchers, conferences, and journals, and research leadership should really, kind of normalize this discussion around the fact that the research that they put out affects society. It does not, perform in some sort of a vacuum, if you will. But independent of that, some of the other projects at PAI that I found really exciting over the past years has been a project called About ML. So it's essentially a multi-stakeholder kind of multi-year project, which is looking at documentation practices for machine learning systems. How are they built? What's the data that goes into it? What are the different outcomes that it produces? And my colleagues are really working to kind of identify how can we standardize that process, and how can that be a process that helps outsiders really understand what's going on inside a machine learning system. So I'm really excited about the results from that, which have been gradual and kind of ongoing, but should culminate in like a best practice in the industry.
And I guess the point of doing that is to have better transparency, accountability stuff in data science practice.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's talk about the recommendations. So you mentioned that there was this white paper that I've had a brief look at, which is all about if you're researching or if you're in the research community, some subjects to do with AI, there might be impactful in a way that is maybe unknown to you, or maybe that you should take more time to pay attention to what your research might impact down the road. And I guess one of the biggest examples of this is like GTP2, right? Like when GTP2 came out with OpenAI, they had this publication on their website saying we're kind of worried about this, right? We're worried about things that we are doing currently, and this is why. Here's some reasons. We're going to give you, a small amount of the output to give you a taste, but we're not going to give you the whole thing. And there was this kind of like thought process that went into what if people have general access to this technology? Is that going to be a bad thing or not? So that's kind of like an interesting kind of turning point of like or point of reference. I guess where did this document come from? Like why was it produced? And who is it for, I guess, as well?
Great. And yeah, that's kind of one of the important incidents that's happened in this space over the last few years, which is one of the major kind of AI research labs called OpenAI. They put out something called GPT-2, which is Generative Pre-trained Transformer. That's what it's short for. And essentially what they did was, kind of adopt a staged release approach. So it's a large language model, and they were concerned about how that model could be misused potentially. And they kind of decided that the community is better off not having access to that entire model to begin with, and to kind of gradually consider what are some of the risks that could come from access or use of that model. But moving on to the white paper itself, it's incidents like these and some other instances where AI research papers have really come under the scan over the last few years that made it clear that there are real societal consequences for the work that people put out. And there have been trends of increasing commercialization of AI research. There's been a lot of interest from governments to kind of leverage it and regulate it. And I think finally, I think the reality of it is that anything and everything that we use these days have some sort of an element of AI in it. And that really made it clear that the AI research community is at the front lines of a technology in the past 10 years, which is being increasingly deployed. So they really need to consider what's kind of the responsibility of the work that they put out there. But what the white paper does is be really mindful of the pressures that AI researchers are currently under. Often there's a publish and perish philosophy, publish or perish. And, you either have to kind of meet those deadlines, create that kind of profile, publishing a lot of papers at conferences and journals, and that's a lot of pressure for young AI researchers to be under. So what we've really considered is what's a way in which researchers can begin to reflect on potential negative downstream consequences of their work, but how can we do it in a way that there's least overhead as possible? How can we do it in a way where the gatekeepers, who are the conferences and journals, can really start to incentivize and encourage this kind of culture of responsibility within the community. And I think part of this, I think what's important to remember is that this is just the beginning, right? Other scientific communities like biosecurity and cybersecurity have really come to terms with the fact that they often deal with harmful information, and that they have to be careful about how they share that information in a research product. So that's often called dual use research, right? Where the same research can be put to a societal benefit, but can also be devastating or even catastrophic to society in many ways. And that's really that moment that has come to the AI community right now, where they're beginning to contend with the fact that they owe a responsibility not just to each other within the community, they owe a responsibility not just to the pursuit of scientific inquiry, but also really they might owe a responsibility to society, knowing what we know about AI and how it's being deployed in the world, and some of the unfair and unsafe outcomes that it can produce.
And I guess it's weird you say that, because it's almost like you should be somewhat cognizant of your responsibility towards society anyway. But I guess we have to, spell it out, because I guess not all research obviously impacts catastrophically. So maybe we've started from this position of not negligence, but safety. And as we're going up and changing and doing different research, maybe we don't know necessarily that we're doing some research which might be detrimental in some way. Yeah, so it's interesting how those things become normalized. And I think in that white paper you were talking about some of these words, like making it normalized, or normalizing, commending, changing the atmosphere around how we conduct this sort of thing.
No, that you're completely right. I think the challenge really starts when you kind of consider a particular outcome from a research which was unintended, right? Because often when you're a researcher, you're really thinking about that one thing, you're optimizing for that one thing, and that's really the intended consequence that you envision is the significance behind the paper, or that's why it's meaningful in the literature. But the challenge really arises when it's an unintended consequence, but perhaps it was a foreseeable consequence. So it's that kind of window where it becomes clear that there is something that the researcher can exercise there to really be able to consider some of those foreseeable consequences, but it requires really moving your attention towards what's unintended. That's not something you thought about, but hey, this is something that could happen. So one of the examples that we share is, let's think of a researcher who's putting out some work on a new video manipulation technique, right? So the intended outcome for that researcher can be that it can be used in face swapping, like in action movies or in animation. But the unintended consequence that the researcher must consider and perhaps articulate is that it can also be used in non-consensual imagery that can be used in deepfakes. And it's really about articulating that trade-off, right? Because this entire exercise of thinking about negative downstream consequences is not going to catch every single potential bad outcome of a research product that's being put out there. I think that's that's a threshold that this is not aiming to satisfy, mostly because it can be impossible to be able to foresee exactly the different ways in which something can be put out in the world and can go wrong. But instead, this is really an exercise in thinking carefully about the trade-offs, because there are often trade-offs. We know AI research is dual use, and being able to articulate it, and in some case, if necessary, being able to take steps to either mitigate some of the dangers. You can redact portions of the paper, or you can, do what OpenAI did with the stage release, or maybe not share the code. Or in some cases, maybe you have to go back to the drawing board and really think more carefully about the research question itself. But it's really an exercise in pursuing, scientific openness. It's really requiring researchers to be more open versus less open. I think that's kind of where the fear often comes up. Is this an initiative to forbid science? And that's where, I'd like to push back. This is really not about forbidding any particular branch of scientific inquiry. It's really about, thinking more carefully about what this research really produces. So it's really an exercise in being more open and transparent about the risks that can come from AI research.
You say it's not against any particular research inquiry, but is there a sense that you could be, going too far, and there might be, like you say, going back to the drawing board, but like downing tools and just saying, well, we've asserted that this is actually something which is going to be too detrimental, and is that something that would have to be ascertained through the institution, the researchers themselves, maybe peer review, these mechanisms, right? There's just different mechanisms that you can progress through, and presumably these sorts of things will get picked up in that process and maybe pushed back on.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think there could be two different outcomes when it comes to a particular AI research, right? The first instance, which we discussed already, is where there's some sort of a dual use risk. Perhaps a portion of it, requires sharing of some harmful information, and you have to really think carefully about, whether the risks or the benefits of sharing that harmful information outweigh the risks. So one of the examples that I can think of is when the conversation around gain of function research really picked up back in 2012, where this whole question of a harmful mutation of the bird flu virus that was created in a lab came up, and it was a question of, should you publish that or should you not publish that? And there, the values that came up was, it's important to, kind of share information about that new mutation because it's highly communicable. It's important for healthcare workers around the world to know that this could be a case that they have to consider soon, and they should know the warning signs. But the risks were that that very mutation, which was created in a lab, could be weaponized, could become a subject of a bioterrorist attack. So this is kind of an instance of where a research product can produce, can kind of provoke dual use, concerns. And in those cases, it's clearer that you have to think more carefully about mitigating some of the risks. So in this instance of this paper about a new virus mutation of bird flu, they decided to publish it anyway because the conclusion that the community came to was that the benefits outweigh the risks. But this is something you really have to think about on a case-by-case basis, right? It's a second set of instances where it can get a bit more, challenging or murkier. So this is where the research question might be considered morally objectionable. And that's when, it becomes less clear exactly what's the best way to proceed, right? Because redaction does not make a whole lot of sense if the research question in itself can be really harmful, to certain groups in our society. For instance, one of the papers that's come into sharp focus in the last few years was a paper on predicting criminality based on facial features. And there's a lot of backlash from within the community. So this paper wasn't published yet. But there was a lot of backlash, and there was a call from the community to not publish this paper in any venue because the paper really doesn't take into account decades of science on phrenology, which is that facial features can't really be used to predict, a human's behavior or their characteristics or traits. So that's another instance of where, the question can be perhaps morally questionable, where there's, people from within the community and outside might really think that this isn't a question we should be pursuing in the first case. But the truth of the matter is that this is going to be really a minority of cases, right? In most instances, it could be a research question that can be tweaked a little bit. It can be a research question where perhaps you really talk to the expert on the ground. So if it's a question about How do you introduce automation in child welfare agencies? Maybe what the researcher can do is talk to actual specialists on the ground. Or it could be instances where you just make sure your data set is more representative, that you consider minoritized communities, that you consider different socioeconomic behaviors. And in those cases, you really don't have to not publish. There's no question of publishing it or not publishing it, because you can do stuff that's within your, kind of power to be able to change the course of that question. So really, it's that tiny set of cases where you might have to decide not to publish for the benefit of the community and society in general. But yeah.
So it sounds reasonable, right? So do you have any? I mean, obviously, we talked about the fact that the paper itself is called the 6 recommendations, and we've talked about some of those recommendations already in some of the forms. Is there some of those recommendations that we haven't touched on yet that we can kind of pursue?
Sure. So I think one of the main takeaway for your listeners can be that what this white paper really calls for is to normalize the discussion around negative downstream consequences. So one of the ways that we recommend this can be done is for individual researchers to really become more open about the motivation and also the extent of the contribution within their paper. And we really say that because often motivation is really important to be able to understand where the researcher is coming from, and it can also shed light on what are the different ways in which it can go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the unintended consequences that the researcher has not considered? The level of contribution is really important because the rule of thumb that we come up with in this paper is that the ethical reflection can be proportional to the level of contribution. So if it's, let's say, incremental, really you only have to consider that kind of particular advancement in that AI technique that you have furthered and think about how that can really impact society. Because you can always cite other work that's considered, the domain itself. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if someone is trying to further, let's say, an incremental advance in facial recognition, the responsibility of the researcher there wouldn't be to consider all of facial recognition research and what we know are the harms that emanate from it, but to really be able to cite some work that does that, but more carefully think about that particular advance that they have proposed in their paper. Because researchers really have a unique vantage point into that one thing. They're really the experts on what they are proposing. And that's what we want to draw attention to when we call for researchers to ethically reflect. So in cases where the level of contribution is much higher, let's say it's a new technique that can be, scaled at a level that we haven't seen before, that is incredibly large in its size. And in those cases, the ethical reflection clearly has to be a lot more. And it's proportional to the advancement that the authors come up with. So this NI rule of thumb is really about what I said before, right? How do you kind of reduce the overhead? How do you make sure that this ethical reflection happens early on in the research process? It really does not have to happen at the publication stage, where it can get so much harder to kind of pivot, but it can happen at a much earlier stage. And I think one of the things that we really kind of endorse here is that we don't expect AI researchers to become like futurists overnight, right? This is really hard. Yeah. This is the first time this community is contending with the realities of how their research can impact society. So it's really more about how do AI researchers talk to people from different domains? How do we, how can research leadership kind of encourage more partnership with interdisciplinary researchers, hold seminars and creative discussions on, what is the project that they're working on and what are the motivations, what are the ways in which it can go wrong, if it's used by the wrong people. And part of this is also recognizing that there are disciplines that have thought about this, far more deeply than the AI research community has. So if you think about historians, you think about political scientists, especially from different geographies, you really start to consider, hey, these are the people who know how authoritarian regimes can use government, can use technology to control or surveil, minorities and discriminate against them. And that kind of knowledge isn't something that is, perhaps easily accessible right now for an AI researcher. And I think that's something for the community to consider. How do we make it easier to be able to kind of forge some of these relationships? So the community is just able to build capacity to really think about how the technology can be used. I don't know, 5-6 years down the line, maybe even decades down the line.
Mm-hmm. So, that sounds like a call for more collaboration between disciplines, as well as what would be lovely is what you were saying before would be a quintessential, here is a start at all the different issues with a particular region of the AI process or technique or whatever it is. So you were referring to face recognition. Here is everything we have on face recognition, and there's some sort of well documented article which just scopes that all out, and people could refer to it. So we need people. If there isn't, I'm sure there is this work already there. It's just having it accessible to, I'm working on this particular thing. I can go and look over here. It's got a lot of what I'm going to be thinking about. I can reference that, and then I'm going to think further, probably to do with the, has it captured everything? Is it capturing the novelty of what I'm producing? And I like the references in the white paper around, obviously you were saying that not everyone has to be a futurist, but that you can utilize some tools like design fictions, workshopping, talking to affected parties. So if you're building something which was to do with crime detection, and then you can talk to parties like police institutions or individuals which get affected by, there's all these things that we can do. So I guess it's scoping those sorts of things out, which the things that make sense in that particular instance, and making sure that becomes part of your methodology, I guess, for that research.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what's really important to consider is that this is going to help researchers, right? What you mentioned, like if it's going to be a paper on predicting criminality or something to be used in the criminal justice domain, talking to the affected parties is really going to be something that's going to help you refine the question better. It's going to help you identify what are the gaps that really matter in practice, that perhaps automation can play a role. But also you can come away thinking, hey, maybe this isn't a domain where we should be proposing for any sort of a AI tool. Maybe the domain isn't ready yet, or maybe we haven't considered like false positives. So this is really a process which can help the entire research inquiry as well. And it can be a critical facet of how one considers scientific inquiry, which is how does that particular research operate on the ground when it's kind of deployed. But yeah.
It's interesting because it's like you're saying, like taking a certain stance, like you're viewing your research from a direction, and that direction is, how does this impact us? Like, is this useful for society, right? How can it be used? But I guess there must be a point. This is probably going down kind of like more philosophical tangent, but there must be a point where you may have to take the opinion, like maybe GTP2 and OpenAI, where you're considering the optimistic or the pessimistic view. This research could be really good if people use it well. But it's got this dual use thing going, and I've identified that. And, obviously you can have a look at the mitigation techniques. But are you calling for just being very explicit with all this stuff? So just being like, this does have dual use. We think these are the use cases. We've done X, Y, and Z because of this fact. Contact us if you want to know more about it, about this particular research project. In a similar way to the bird flu research must have undergone. Yeah, it's just interesting to me how this would actually play out, and how those decisions get made in face of bad actors, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So one of the things that OpenAI did with the release of GPT-2 was they drew attention to the fact that there was a societal value that they were concerned about. They were concerned about perhaps these large language models being used to perpetuate more disinformation, can be used to create language to harass people. And so it became clear for the community exactly the societal value that they were thinking about and how that clashes with the principle of openness, and why they decided not to publish the model at the first stage. But that's not to say that this is an easy trade-off to make. I think often, this analysis of do the risks or kind of outweigh the benefits can be a complicated one. And different parties can come to different conclusions. So there was a pushback to the staged release of GPT-2 when several members of the community were like, hey, you know what? It takes massive compute to be able to replicate something like that model. That compute is perhaps not easily accessible to a lot of actors, and perhaps even malicious actors. So maybe the risks don't outweigh the benefits in this case. So that's really an important kind of process of where you realize that different people can come to different conclusions. But the only way we can build capacity is to be as transparent about it as possible, as you said. If you're redacting a portion of the paper, you should be able to speak to why you chose to redact it. What is that societal value that you're concerned about? Are you concerned about it being used to create non-consensual imagery that will affect women disproportionately? In which case, spelling it out is really the only way the entire community can iterate and start to think more about, hey, was that assessment of risks and benefit? Was it the right way to go, or do we differ on that particular assessment? Because the reality of it is that you are making this assessment in a vacuum, right? In some cases, you might have important precedents from history, from different scientific domains that can really help sharpen how you think about that trade-off. But in many instances, you're probably the first one doing it. You're kind of working in a vacuum, which was kind of the case with OpenAI with the release of the large language model. So the verdict's not out yet, and you can't perhaps in some cases wait to find out. You can't put out something that's harmful and then find out, hey, it's been weaponized. Looks like we might want to take it down. So this is going to be an iterative process. But the reality is we are only really going to be able to get better at it if people aren't, not going to, people need to share that information. Because if we don't share that information, that's when, there's no learnings. We don't come to, we don't have this conversation where we can think about how risks and benefits, how the trade-off is getting made. So it's really about being as transparent about it as possible. And more importantly, it's really a central tenet of the scientific field, which is openness, right? If you think about, how citation practices are really important, how they have to acknowledge what's the previous work in a particular field, how they come together to review each other's work. It becomes really clear that the means of doing research is one of transparency and one of openness. Because it's kind of born out of a realization that all of scientific research is incremental. No singular advancement happens because you came up with it from scratch, right? It's really building off of other people's kind of scientific knowledge as well. So in that kind of pursuit of openness, it's also important to be open and talk openly about what are some of the risks that you foresaw, and that kind of provoked you to maybe not put it out in its entirety.
Is there anything coming through in your organization? What exciting things are happening?
Great. So what my mandate is over the course of this year is to really think about how can we get different research labs and different conferences and journals to really adopt the recommendations that we have in our white paper. So one of the first responses we heard from the community was from the journal Nature Machine Intelligence. So they put out an op-ed endorsing the recommendations of the white paper, and they've decided to ask for social impact statements from researchers when the research involves human or socioeconomic data. So that's a great first step already. So part of my kind of process is to think carefully about what are some of the reactions that people from the community have? What are some of the reasons they might not want to adopt it? And how can we consider some of that while we think about a next iteration of the white paper, perhaps? But yeah, part of this is really, part of the outcome here is to kickstart this conversation, which is kind of why I'm here on the podcast as well, right? it's an important conversation, not just for the insiders in the community. I think that's what's really important. Because when we think about some of the risks from the technology community, that was an open conversation that a lot of people were intrigued and excited about, and they were curious to learn more. And that was not contained to people within the scientific community. So we're kind of going through a similar moment where we're having this larger kind of reflection with insiders and with people from outside, like policymakers, to really think carefully about how do we ethically reflect as a community.
Yeah, and I guess you have somewhat access to your partners, right? So getting those people, organizations on board. Is there something, for our audience here, is there something more general that if they have some interesting insight, or they are working for an organization who maybe are not part of the partnership on AI, is there any way of getting involved or giving you feedback or agreeing with you? How would they do that?
Yes, I think that's such an important part of this entire process, which is there are a lot of researchers, right, within tech companies, within academic institutions, and many of them have different review practices, both internally and even, like, let's say, how they individually approach that entire process of from the research question to the final product. So it's really helpful to learn from the community where they think some of the challenges might be. What are some of the blockers that they are facing? Because this report is really about the people on the front lines, the researchers themselves. So, feel free to reach out. We have an email ID on our website. Feel free to contact me on Twitter or LinkedIn, because we really can't do this without any of you. So if anyone's out there and you're like, I want to start ethically reflecting on what I'm putting out in the world, now's your chance. Reach out, and happy to kind of get you involved in our next steps.
Sweet. So I think we're getting towards the end of our podcast. For you, I was wondering, maybe less so about partnership on AI, but I was wondering if you have your own kind of ideas about what is exciting and what might be a little bit scary about the future of AI and our society.
Ooh, that's a great question. I think the question, what really brought me to this work and what I've been really intrigued by is how important it is for, there to be norms that are developed in a bottom-up kind of fashion, right? So I'm trained as a lawyer, and in my past work, a lot of my work was all about how governments need to regulate technology. It was more about top-down approaches. But what's become clear is that this technology is progressing at a rate much faster than anyone anticipated. We can't really wait around for regulation or any sort of a prescriptive guidance from any sort of an authority or an institution. And it's become really clear to me, especially through this work, that it's really important for non-traditional kind of legal community norms to take its place instead. So I think what's really exciting, and I think also perhaps what can be a bit terrifying, is exactly, kind of the important position that AI researchers and AI teams right now really play, and how they need to kind of really take up this entire cause for us to see some quick gains. Because if not, I think it can be really, really hard to be able to turn the ship around. And I think that's what's been really keeping me up, not at night, but I guess just getting me interested, getting me super excited about what I do during my day job.
Sweet. That's good to hear. Madhu, thank you for your time. How do people follow you, read your stuff, ask you questions? How do they do that?
That's great. So you can find me on Twitter. That's perhaps the easiest way to reach out to me. I'm also on LinkedIn. But really, you can just find me on the website as well. I'm always happy to chat. Always happy to learn from all of your listeners.
Hi, and welcome to the end of the podcast. Thanks again to Madhu for coming on the show and talking to us about partnership on AI, research, and how we can all kind of work together, pushing the boundaries of AI, and hopefully doing it in a way that is respecting human agency, all these rights and things which are good that we want to hold on to. We've fought so hard in the past to obtain, and hopefully go forward and give ourselves more agency in the future. Really lovely conversation. I think some of the things they have in that article, those recommendations, are just kind of almost no-brainers. And I don't know if it's them focusing more on the maybe private entities who are producing more proprietary research. That's a possibility, and trying to get them to hopefully be more open, and also looking at those research projects which maybe have negative impact and have obvious things that maybe you shouldn't be doing. A good one that comes straight to mind is maybe the example about the sexual orientation research project, which maybe is just, maybe it's just not useful to have in the world. Anyway, thanks for sticking around. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/machine ethics, and I'll see you next time.